Welcome back. And today we visit a headstone at St Margaret's Church in Betley in Cheshire. The headstone reads, "This stone was erected by subscription to the memory of Mary Malpas, the beloved daughter of John and Anne Malpas, who, at the age of 15 years 10 months, on the night of June 28, 1835, was basely and cruelly murdered in Chapel Field, Hunstanton, by Thomas Bagley, an elderly married man. He escaped the punishment of the law by adding his own death to that of his innocent victim." Following is a transcript of a report in the Staffordshire Advertiser, July 1835. Murder and suicide at Doddington. The residents at this delightful place and neighbourhood, the demesne of Sir J. Broughton, which, as most of our readers are aware, is on the confines of Cheshire and adjoining to the western side of Staffordshire, were thrown into a state of the greatest anxiety and alarm on Monday morning last by the awful intelligence that a young female had been found in a field cruelly murdered. The melancholy tidings were speedily authenticated, and almost all doubts as to the perpetrator of the horrid crime were removed by another gloomy circumstance: the discovery that a man had hung himself at a short distance from the place where the poor girl had lost her life, and connected with suspicious circumstances that naturally led to the conclusion that he had been the murderer. We proceed to place before our readers the details of these tragical and melancholy occurrences. The unfortunate female thus early brought to an untimely end was a domestic in the house of H. Davison, Esquire, Sir John Broughton's land steward, where she had lived about 12 months, during which time her conduct had been most exemplary. The age of the unfortunate female was 16, and she is described as having been a remarkably fine girl, with pleasing manners and of an address rather superior to her situation in life. Her parents reside about a mile from Mr. Davison's, and are said to have brought up their family in the most praiseworthy manner. The deceased was the third of a family of 6 children. The man suspected to have committed the murder, Thomas Bagley, was also in the service of Mr. Davison as a labourer, in which service he had been for the last 4 years. He had previously been employed for 21 years by Mr. Richard Dobson, and had the character of a quiet, honest, hard-working. He was of rather a reserved disposition and not given to conversation. He was about 50 years of age and had a wife and a family of 8 children living. From his conduct for a number of years, the last suspicion that would have arisen was that he would perpetrate any such offence as that now attributed to him. Nor is it known that the slightest intimacy existed between him and the young woman. The leading facts connected with this melancholy affair at present known are as follows. On Monday morning, just after midnight, Mrs. Davison was awake by Mary Malpas, the deceased, knocking at her door and asking if she might leave the house, as someone had brought her word that her mother was dangerously ill and wanted her to go home directly. Mrs. D did not ask who the messenger was, but immediately gave her permission, and heard her go downstairs and out of the doors, never to return again. Mrs. D soon afterwards went down to see that the door was secure, when she found it was locked and the key gone, taken, as she supposed, by the young woman in order to let herself in again on her return. On Mr. Davison's family rising in the morning, a ladder was found on the grass plot below the window of the girl's room. It had been brought from another part of the premises, and it is supposed for the purpose of awakening the young woman without disturbing the family. The body of the young woman was found about 5 o'clock in a field not a quarter of a mile from Mr. Davison's house, in the state hereafter described. There was no footpath through this field, and it was not the shortest way to the house where the parents of the young woman lived, although a person might go that way, and it would be only a little circuitous. The body of the man was found as described by the witness in about an hour afterwards, and the 2 striking facts that he would not go to bed at his own house, though repeatedly desired to do so, but was left up, and that he had the key in his pocket which the young woman had to let herself out of the house. These two facts prove almost a demonstration that Bagley was the man who veiled the girl from the house under the false pretense of her mother's illness, and in the sequel perpetuated the awful crime of murder. Our readers will draw their own conclusion from the evidence given at the inquest and now laid before them. The opinion formed by those who reside upon the spot and are best acquainted with the circumstances is that the wretched man's contrivance of decoying the ill-fated girl from her master's house in the dead of night was only with the intention of gratifying a lust which under all the circumstances cannot be attributed to anything less than satanic influence, and then finding the unfortunate object of his desires virtuous to death, and fearing his iniquitous conduct would come to light, deprived his hapless victim of her life. Supposing this view to be correct, it is easy to imagine that, stung with remorse and goaded by the same fiend-like spirit, the wretched man decided to finish the tragical occurrence by a suicidal act. Inquests were held on view of the bodies on Tuesday before F. Thomas Esquire, coroner, and evidence given in substance as follows. Mr. George of Doddington Farm was foreman of the jury. The jury being sworn viewed the body of the female at her father's house where it lay, and then, for want of room, adjourned to Mr. Dobson's. After a patient investigation of that case, and finding the verdict as stated below, they proceeded to Mr. Davison's, where the body of the unfortunate man was, and having heard the evidence, found the verdict, which is also given below. Inquest on view of the body of Mary Malpas. Mrs. Davison, wife of Henry Davison, Esquire, land steward to Sir John Broughton of Doddington, being sworn, deposed as follows. The deceased, Mary Malpas, was my servant maid on the 28th of June, and on the evening of that day she retired to bed about 9:30. I did not observe anything particular or contrary to her usually modest deportment prior to her retiring to rest. About 12:30 on the same night, I was awoke by someone knocking at my bedroom door, and the deceased said, "Mistress, shall I go and see my mother, who was taken dangerously ill and likely to be dead?" I said, "Certainly you may go," but did not ask her who called her up, supposing it to be either her father or one of her brothers. I did not hear anyone about the house, but heard the deceased go downstairs and in a short time leave the house. I came downstairs to lock the front door and found it locked and the key gone. I supposed the deceased had taken it, that on her return she might let herself into the house without disturbing the family. It was our invariable custom to leave the key to the front door on the sideboard in the parlour. It was left there when I went to bed, but in the morning both the inner door and front door were wide open. Simeon Davis, servant to Mr. George of Doddington Farm, deposed as follows. About 5:00 on Monday morning, the 29th of June, I was going to fetch up my master's cows, and on going through Chapel Field, Hunstanton, about a quarter of a mile from Doddington, I saw a woman lying on the ground near the hedge. She was lying on her back, but inclining towards her right side. Her gown and petticoats appeared much disordered. She had her bonnet on, but it was much torn in front, and her cloak was rucked up and lay under her head as if she had been violently struggling. 2 clean aprons which were folded up and her comb lay by her side. I did not observe any marks of violence on her person. I felt at her and found she was quite dead. I did not know her. Ralph Latham, my fellow servant, was with me. We neither of us knew her. Her face was much drawn on one side and discoloured. We supposed she was a stranger. We both knew the deceased well when she was alive, but had no idea that the woman we saw in the field was Mary Malpas. We left her where we first saw her and returned to our masters, met several persons on the road and told them that there was a woman lying dead in Chapel Field. Mr. John Twemlow, surgeon of Hatherton, deposed. About 10:00 on Monday the 29th, I was sent for to examine the body of a woman who was found dead in a field near Pepper Street, Moss. I found her lying on her back, inclining to her right side. On examining her person, I found considerable blackness and darkness around her neck, with here and there a scratch. The discoloration on the neck seemed to have been made from violent pressure of the hand and appeared general round the throat. On examining the lower part of her body, I found a considerable degree of blackness on the inside of her thighs and several scratches. If to violate her person had been the object of her destroyer, I have every reason to believe he did not effect his purpose. The ground round about where she lay was much disturbed, as if two persons had been violently struggling, and I am decidedly of opinion the deceased came to her death by strangulation from some person's hands. Anne Malpas, wife of John Malpas, bricklayer, and mother of the deceased, deposed. The deceased, Mary Malpas, was my daughter and lived with Mr. Davison of Doddington. I did not send on the 28th anyone to my daughter to say I was ill, and if she wished to see me alive must come directly. I was not at all unwell on that day, but as well as ever I was in my life. John Shuker, labourer of Hunstanton, deposed. Yesterday morning, on the 29th of June, I went to the house of Mr. Davison of Doddington to meet Thomas Bagley, labourer, who had agreed the previous evening to assist me in loading some calves. In consequence of Bagley not coming to his work at Mr. Davison's as usual, Mrs. Davison asked me to go to his house to inquire for him. I saw his wife, who said he had not been at home the whole of the night. On returning to Mrs. Davison's, she desired to tie up the cows and suckle the calves, and by that time Bagley might be come to his work. After tying up the cows, I went to fetch the calves out of the hay crib adjoining the cow house, thinking the calves might be there, though it was not the usual place they were kept in. A hasp was on the staple of the doorpost, and a hanging lock through the staple, but not locked. On opening the door, I observed a man's legs, the knees of which were bent and his feet touching the straw under him. I started back alarmed. On recovering myself, I went in, and taking him by the shoulders, I turned his face towards me and saw it was Thomas Bagley. He was suspended by a rope tied around his neck with a running noose, fastened to a ladder which was over the hole where the hay is put down into the hay crib below to fodder the cows. On seeing his face, I knew it to be Thomas Bagley, Mr. Davison's labourer. He was quite dead. I alarmed Mr. Davison's family and went with two men to the hay crib, when Simeon Davis took out his knife and cut him down. It was a small cord which was round his neck. I then asked Mrs. Davison for the keys of the stable. She could not find them, but said Bagley might have them in his pocket, and desired me to examine. On feeling in his pockets, I found several keys, which I took out. One of the keys opened the stable door, and the rest I hung on a nail in the inside of the stable. I do not know whether I took from his pocket the key to the front door, but if I see it, I can tell whether it is the same I took out of Bagley's pocket. The key of Mr. Davison's door, by which the young woman let herself out, was brought. The key now produced is one of those I took out of his pocket and hung on a nail in the inside of the stable. Thomas Bagley, labourer, son of the deceased, deposed. I work on the railroad, but generally sleep at home at the week's end. I was at my father's house on Sunday night, the 28th. My mother asked my father to go to bed several times. About 9:30 she went to bed, and about 10 o'clock she requested him to go with her. He said, "I am coming," but did not follow her. I then locked the door and left the key in the lock and said, "Father, come to bed." He again said, "I am coming," but did not follow me. When I was in bed, I heard my mother several times call to him to come to bed. His answer invariably was, "I am coming." About 2 o'clock my mother awoke, and not finding him in bed, she went downstairs. He was not in the house. The door was locked and the key put under the door. I got up about 4 o'clock and found the door locked and the key put under. When I went to bed, I locked the door and left the key in the lock. The jury, after a few minutes' consultation, returned a verdict: wilful murder against Thomas Bagley, deceased, for having in the night of Sunday, June 28th, feloniously and wilfully destroyed the deceased Mary Malpas by strangulation. Inquest on view of the body of Thomas Bagley. Simeon Davis, a labourer of Mr. George's of Doddington Farm, deposed as follows. Monday morning, June 29th, I was alarmed by John Shuker, who came from Mr. Davison's, saying that Thomas Bagley had hung himself. I went with him to Mr. Davison's, and on going to the place where fodder is put down for the use of the cows, I saw a man hanging by a rope or small cord fastened round his neck, with his knees bent and nearly touching the ground. I took out my knife and cut the cord, and I laid him down. He was quite dead. It was the body of Thomas Bagley. The cord was fastened to the stave off a ladder, placed over the hole where the hay is put down into the hay crib below. Verdict: that the deceased feloniously and wilfully destroyed himself by suspending himself to a ladder with a small cord on the morning of the 29th of June. In 1998, a story ran in a Warrington newspaper claiming Thomas Bagley was a victim of a miscarriage of justice. A retired teacher claims she's unearthed a grave injustice whilst digging into her family history. Now she aims to put the record straight and clear the name of her great-great-great-grandfather, branded a murderer more than 160 years ago after the death of a 15-year-old girl, and his apparent suicide. Years of research have led Janet Eastner and her group of local supporters to believe that Thomas Bagley was not guilty of the horrendous crime that still taints his name. He was never tried, as his body was found hanging in a barn a few miles from Crewe on the Delves Broughton estate at Hunsterston just 1 hour after the murder, but inquests clearly condemned him. Today the gravestone of the murdered girl, Mary Malpas, still proclaims his guilt. It stands in Betley churchyard, the inscription weather-beaten, but still clear for all to see. When Mrs. Eastner from Hungerford found that the branches of her family tree spread to South Cheshire, and that the skeletons in her cupboard included a murderer, she was shocked. I felt pretty sick about it, and for some time I just accepted what evidence I had. But then I began to delve into the story. I tracked down records and newspaper reports that covered the inquests of Mary and Tom. The more I read, the more I felt there had been a tragic injustice, she said. Tom was condemned as a murderer solely because the key to a land agent's house that had been in Mary's keeping was found in his pocket when he was cut down from the barn in which he was found hanging. But Janet claims that most of the other facts revealed at the inquest indicate a very different story. She believes that Tom was made a scapegoat for someone else's crime, the murder and attempted rape of the 15-year-old, and that he was also murdered. Tom's own daughter had been raped, and Janet believes her ancestor could have stumbled on the man responsible for that as he attacked the other girl. The two lasses were friends. We have some idea who it may have been, but of course we can't make any accusations as we simply have no concrete proof, said Janet. Psychic artists and mediums have helped in her mission, along with members of the South Cheshire Family History Society. Phil Coops, who lives in Mary's home village of Betley, is also convinced of Tom's innocence. It's been a mammoth hunt for the truth. We think we're pretty close, but proving it will be very difficult, he said. But the main object is not to find the real murderer, but to clear Tom's name, he added. Janet's ultimate objective is to have Tom's remains removed from their resting place in unconsecrated ground near the gateway of Wybunbury Church and reburied in the churchyard alongside his wife's. A descendant of Mary's family lives in Betley and would be happy if this happened. He's a lay preacher and would even take part in a service, said Janet. She would also like to see a plaque placed next to Mary's grave disclaiming the words on the stone.